Hello and welcome back to 10 Things About Writing. Thank you so much for everybody who bought my book. I hope it's helped you. I'm going to continue to do these little mini seminars on here and also on Twitter, particularly if it's something that I haven't covered already in depth in my book. And today I'm going to talk about something that a lot of people believe to be an immutable rule in writing. Now, I've always felt that immutable rules were a bit of a dangerous thing to teach people because they're not rules and they're not immutable. But I encounter them all the time from well-intentioned creative writing teachers and also well-intentioned creative writing students. And it's important to know when a general guideline about writing can be helpful and when it really can't. This one is the show, don't tell rule, which is a particular bugbear of mine because it's really not a rule. It's one of those generalizations that they teach writers when they are very young, sometimes in primary school, but which adult writers need to properly deconstruct and look at and determine whether it is the right way of thinking for the thing that they are writing themselves. Having said that, it is often very helpful to understand the distinction between showing and telling and thinking hard about which one to use. For instance, we're often told that it's a bad idea to say something like, so-and-so is very clever. Instead, you have to show them doing something clever. On the other hand, you have certain authors, Jane Austen is one of them, who invariably introduces her characters as clever or sensible before any action has started at all. And this is because the action of a Jane Austen novel isn't the same kind of action that you would expect from, shall we say, a Lee Child novel. You wouldn't get Lee Child saying something like, Reacher is a fast and reactive thinker. You'd expect him to show you Reacher doing something fast and reactive as part of a fast-paced action sequence, because guess what? Lee Child books tend to be fast action-based, whereas Jane Austen's books tend to be calmer, more considerate, more internalized, character-driven. And this is not to say that either approach is bad or better or worse than the other. It absolutely depends on what you're trying to do. Not everybody wants to be Jane Austen, not everybody wants to be Lee Child, and when somebody quotes Chekhov at you and says, don't give me the moon was full, give me instead the gleam of moonlight on water, not everybody wants to be Chekhov either. Sometimes it is expedient within the plot to say the moon was full, and not to go dicking around with lighting effects, because that would slow down and undermine the thing you were trying to do. And sometimes it is wonderful to go on for a paragraph or two about the reflections of the moon on water, and this is also fine. But neither is something that you can say, this is an immutable rule that I must follow. And so, like all these deceptive shortcuts that you are told by creative writing teachers who are trying to simplify things, in fact, the truth is much more complicated. And actually, you should be trying to complicate things. You should be questioning the rules you are taught, because that is the sign of a grown-up writer, rather than a writer who is always going to stay a juvenile writer thinking inside a box. And there's a reason you tell a story. And there's a reason you show a film. Some books are more filmic and you tend to have more showing. Some books are more narrative and you tend to do more telling. However, all books, I think, should have a fairly broad range of both. Now, as with most things, the trick is knowing when to show and when to tell. With characters, reinforcement is absolutely the key. It is perfectly okay to say at the beginning that X is clever, but you have to reinforce that. If you don't show X being clever throughout the rest of the book, then your characterization is failing, because you are relying simply on information that you've given the audience, an audience that has no particular reason to trust you, and if they don't then see some kind of proof of what you've told them, then you are revealing yourself to be an untrustworthy narrator and not worthy of continuing. So follow up on what you tell your readership, give them what they expect. The same goes for description. It's a matter for you to decide how much description goes into a passage. But all description has to pay its way. As soon as you start including description for description's sake, for pages and pages, then you're probably overdoing it. And if it doesn't contribute, then bin it. It could contribute atmosphere. It could contribute some kind of information. It could be part of the mood of the story you're telling. But if it doesn't do those things, it doesn't matter how beautiful your description is, it's not paying its way, and you need to bin it. Much of creative writing is actually stepping outside of your author's ego and looking at your work as a reader and going, okay, what is this giving the reader? If all it's giving the reader is a kind of awe at how wonderful you are at describing something, but is not taking them any further, then bin it, or use it somewhere else, or don't bother with it at all. I'm going to give you some examples because examples can sometimes help in this kind of thing. And I'm going to use Lee Child and Jane Austen because, you know, how different could you get? I'm going to start with Lee Child. And as you might expect, he does a fair bit of showing, but he also does a fair bit of telling. And I'm going to read you a little paragraph where he does both for quite a particular reason. This is from the beginning of the book. It's in the first person, unusual for a Jack Reacher book. And he is giving the reader information in order to set up some action later on. So this isn't an action sequence, and it's only a short one, because what he wants the reader to have is information so that he can move on with the reader to something better and more fun. So this is Reacher reading a newspaper, and there is a small ad in it. Right there, centre of the page, a boxed column inch, 5 words printed bold, Jack Reacher, call Rick Shoemaker. Which had to be Tom O'Day's work, which later on made me feel a little lame. Not that O'Day wasn't a smart guy. He had to be. He had survived a long time, a very long time. He had been around forever. 20 years ago, he already looked 100. A tall, thin, gaunt, cadaverous man who moved like he might collapse at any moment, like a broken stepladder. He was no one's idea of an army general, more like a professor, or an anthropologist. Certainly his thinking had been sound. Reacher stays under the radar, which means buses and trains and waiting rooms and diners, which, coincidentally or not, is the natural economic habitat for enlisted men and women who buy the Army Times ahead of any other publication in the PX, and who can be relied upon to spread the paper around, like birds spread seeds from berries. And he could rely on me to pick up the paper, somewhere, sooner or later, eventually, because I needed to know. You can leave the army, but the army doesn't leave you, not completely. As a means of communication, as a way of making contact, from what he knew and from what he could guess, then maybe he would think 10 or 12 consecutive weeks of personal ads might generate a small but realistic chance of success. But it worked the first time out. One day after the paper was printed, which is why I felt lame later on. I was predictable. Rick Shoemaker was Tom O'Day's boy, probably his second in command by now. Easy enough to ignore, but I owed Shoemaker a favour, which O'Day knew about, obviously, which was why he put Shoemaker's name in his ad, and which was why I would have to answer it. Predictable. Okay, this is a classic Lee Child setup. It's a bit of an inciting incident. It's right at the beginning of the first chapter, and in the hands of a less skilled narrator, it might seem a bit like an indigestible info dump, but it's not. It's necessary information, and he is introducing 2 characters here, very fast indeed. One is Rick Shoemaker, and one is Tom O'Day. We haven't met them before, but we've met them now in this short but snappy little paragraph here. And it's pretty much all of it telling. But it's telling that feels like showing too, because it's been cleverly interwoven into the narrative. We've got a situation here, which Reacher reacts to because he's predictable. He's actually telling you that he's predictable. And we know how he feels about this. So he's also showing you something about himself, about his self-awareness. But much of this is about Tom O'Day. And we've got the fact that he's smart, that he's old. We've got what he looks like, quite a nice little description of what he looks like, quite a visual description which gives you a little snapshot as if you've looked at a small thumbnail sketch of the guy so that you can visualize him in your mind, so that there's a little bit of showing there within the telling. There is also something about the way he talks, the whole thing about Reacher stays under the radar, all his analysis of Reacher. It's not only telling you all kinds of stuff about Reacher, it's also showing you how Tom O'Day's mind works. So even in a fast-paced action novel, you've got show and tell nicely interlaced and almost inseparable within the narrative. And this is important to understand. You can't properly just do one without the other. Even in something which seems to be fairly straightforward, fairly filmic, it should most of it be showing it's not actually. There's a lot of pretty much everything in here. And so that's why really the idea of thinking about showing rather than telling and limiting yourself to this is it's going to limit your prose. It's going to make your prose seem juvenile and by the numbers, and I'm pretty sure that you don't want that to happen. Now I'm going to do a little bit from Jane Austen's Persuasion, which is an underrated book really, and again it's from the beginning. Believe it or not, the beginning of novels often requires a little bit of telling, and I'm not talking about a great big fat info dump of information that is going to turn your reader off. But sometimes you need actually to give the reader rapid information to allow them then to move on to the action of the story, knowing something about the characters. Not too much, obviously, because you need to be engaged. You need to want to learn something about these people, but you also need to follow them. You need some kind of a hook. And also you need to know how you are going to engage with them, whether you are supposed to root for them or not, whether they are going to be around for a while and you can afford the time, the investment of emotional energy into this character. Now, Jane Austen is extremely good at doing this, but she also does it in a very tell, don't show kind of way. And this is her style, and it's also the style of the period she was writing in, but it's also pretty effective because it doesn't take very long. It's a shortcut into character, and properly used and deftly used, and she is a very deft writer, much like Lee Child, who is also in his way a very deft writer. She manages to do this so that she can find a way into the action, bring the reader into the action without spending too much time setting the scene. Scene setting is great as long as you're interested in the characters who are going to step onto the scene. Until you are, character is, I think, predominant. Now, this is the family that is central to the story here, the Elliot family. We have just met Sir Walter, and we are going to see the rest of the family more or less through his eyes. This will tell us something about Sir Walter himself, who has spent the last page or so reading about himself in Who's Who, or the baronetcy, or whatever the publication happens to be that talks about him most. And he is now going to talk about his general family. He's going to do it via Jane Austen in the third person, but this is quite close third, so that everything is filtered through his point of view. And this already should be telling you something about Sir Walter himself. For one daughter, his eldest, he would really have given up anything, which he had not been very much tempted to do. Elizabeth had succeeded at 16 to all that was possible of her mother's rights and consequence, and being very handsome and very like himself, her influence had always been great, and they had gone on together most happily. His other two children were of very inferior value. Mary had acquired a little artificial importance by becoming Mrs. Charles Musgrove, but Anne, with an elegance of mind and sweetness of character, which must have placed her high with any people of real understanding, was nobody with either father or sister. Her word had no weight. Her convenience was always to give way. She was only Anne. Well, this is an interesting piece of telling and showing. Initially, it comes across as mostly a description. But because it's a filtered description, it's filtered through the eye of Sir Walter, who we have already learnt to dislike a little, and therefore to mistrust. So we know that actually the people he esteems are probably the people we will not esteem, and vice versa, which is why Anne, with her elegance of mind and sweetness of manner, is immediately seen to be somebody of interest here, whereas the other people who are supposed to be superior to her will be shown to be much less. We know this because we already know that Sir Walter is vain and doesn't have a great deal of intelligence and is not a great judge of character. We've been shown this by him obsessing over his name in various publications. We've also been shown it by the way he views his daughters. But it's also about the telling and the pinpointing of certain characteristics which are going to later be brought out about these characters. Anne is consistently going to be seen as sweet and a little submissive, but also much cleverer than the people around her. Elizabeth is going to be consistently seen as vain, as is her father, Sir Walter. You can kind of see what you're getting from this package already from the first chapter. But it's not just telling, and it's not just showing. It is a clever interleaving of both. And in exactly the same way, if we were to look at, shall we say, visual descriptions rather than character descriptions, again, it is all about balancing what you are going to offer the reader, what the reader needs at any given point. So if you are entering a quiet scene where you need to know more about the whereabouts, then you can afford to have the effects of moonlight on broken glass, particularly if the broken glass is going to be part of the plot and you are going to encounter it later. If, however, you are going to enter a sweeping action scene where your character doesn't have time to look around them because they are too busy doing something fast-paced and active, then you probably won't see those things, and you won't necessarily want the reader to see them either, because if you make the reader look away from the action, your action loses its value. So yes, show don't tell. Not terribly good shorthand for good writing, although it is valuable to understand what those two things mean. Next time I'm going to have a look at another of those little sound bites that creative writing teachers love so much, and I will try to deconstruct what it means. Till then, happy reading, happy writing, have fun, and thank you again for buying my book.